There's a country western song with the lyrics, "I was country when country wasn't cool." On today's video, I want to share the story of a doctor who was low-carb, high-fat, when not only was this diet not cool, it was considered downright heretical and insane. And yet this man who ate this way lived to be 97 years old and led the way for the current keto, low-carb movement. On this video, I want to share with you a little bit about the life and practices of a doctor you need to know. His name is Wolfgang Lutz, and he was preaching a low-carb, high-fat diet back in the day when almost everybody else was saying the opposite. Most of the information I'll be sharing with you I've learned from the book titled My Life Without Bread. Even though the book was titled My Life Without Bread, this was an exaggeration. In YouTube terms, you might almost call it clickbait. Actually, Lutz did eat some bread, but he knew the title would be more arresting to put in those terms. But by my life without bread, what he really meant was my life on a low-carb diet. What's fascinating to me is that Lutz discovered the power and healthiness of a low-carb, high-fat diet at the precise time when America was leading the world into a high-carb, low-fat obsession. Ancel Keys and his buddies were preaching that fat, and especially fat from meats, and even more especially fat from red meat, was the ultimate villain, responsible for nearly all America's heart attacks and nearly all other health issues Americans in the modern world was facing. Their idea was give up the meat almost entirely, and what meat you do allow yourself, make sure it's lean, lean, lean. Eat a little fish and turkey if you have to, but by no means indulge in red meat with lots of fat on it. A fatty steak was a heart attack in the making in their minds. America bought into this fallacious argument and was soon exporting the message with the zeal of an evangelist to the whole world. The food pyramid came into being, which said, load up on those carbs. Have a carb here and a carb there, here a carb, there a carb, everywhere a carb. And yet, while this movement was just taking shape, an Austrian doctor by the name of Wolfgang Lutz was becoming convinced that all the high-carb, low-fat proponents were exactly and completely wrong. It had its roots in Lutz's own health problems. Although a medical doctor, Lutz ate pretty much what he liked to eat and paid little attention to his diet. By the time he was in his 40s, he was falling apart physically. He suffered from terrible, debilitative arthritis, and his right forefinger was so inflamed and painful he couldn't even turn on a light switch. Both his hips were being eaten away with arthritis, and he walked with a limp. He showed a medical colleague an x-ray of his hips without letting him know that this was his own x-ray, and the doctor stated, well, there's not much you can do for this case. He also had frequent infections, and he was constantly sick with colds and coughs. He suffered from continual exhaustion, and often he couldn't work more than 2 hours at a time. He took a cortisone preparation almost every day to keep him going, and a sleeping pill at night. It seemed like he'd soon have to give up his practice and retire while still young and in his 40s. But at this time, he happened across a speech given to the American Medical Association by a Dr. George Thorpe. He was advocating a low-carb diet for dealing with obesity. And he stated, the simplest to prepare and most easily obtainable high-protein, high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, and the one that will produce the most rapid loss of weight without hunger, weakness, lethargy, or constipation, is made up of meat, fat, and water. Thorpe also stated the patient with excess weight not caused by disease must be dealt with as an individual whose excess weight may be due to excessive carbohydrate intake. He said that the standard approach of limiting calories was defective and that the real answer to obesity was a return to a more natural type of diet, which he insisted was the low-carb, high-fat diet. A light bulb went on over the sickly Dr. Lutz's head. He reasoned, if this is the more natural diet and the cure for obesity, could it not also be the cure for arthritis and all the other diseases of civilization? Could it not be a cure for heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and other afflictions which have just surfaced in the last 100 or 200 years? If there was one thing Dr. Lutz was, it was a maverick. Despite all the grave pronouncements by the medical establishment that our health problems were due to meat and fat, Lutz pondered whether perhaps the problem was really sugars, grains, and other carbs. Foods, many of which made up a tiny part of man's diet a couple of hundred years ago, but had now become our primary diet. Lutz had a brilliant and inquisitive mind, and he was soon scouring the literature for the few articles, books, and studies which proposed that sugar and carbs, and not meats and fat, were behind most of the modern diseases and weaknesses. He read about a throat surgeon who recommended to an obese patient named William Banting that he try to lose weight by cutting out sugar and starches from his diet. Banting did so well on this diet, and he lost so much weight, he wrote a small booklet called Letter on Corpulence, which became hugely popular. And often in the 1800s, people who went on a low-carb diet were said to be banting. And sometimes people would ask those on a diet, "Do you bant?" Eventually, Wolfgang Lutz was so convinced this diet was far healthier than the high-carb, low-fat diet that was growing in momentum in those days, that like a good rebel, he went the exact opposite direction and began a 4-year experiment. Starting in 1958, he became a low-carber when low-carb was decidedly uncool. He writes these words, "I cut right down on foods such as sugar, cakes, puddings, chocolate, fruit, and potatoes, intending to eat no bread or cereal foods at all. I ate meat, meat fat, eggs, and full-fat dairy, together with a few vegetable dishes and now and then a little fruit." Like many keto dieters these days, he kept his carbs at around 20 to 30 grams per day. He went cold turkey from a normal diet to a low-carb diet, something he later discouraged, but he had no problems adjusting to his new way of eating. The pain in his forefinger eased significantly, and he soon found he could work all day long without tiring. He had experienced terrible migraine headaches, but as he slashed his carbs, the migraines departed and never returned the rest of his life. He slept better, he had less infections, and the arthritic pain in his hips was largely gone. He began to play tennis once again. Before his revelation, Lutz had already seen that a low-carb diet could be effective in dealing with type 2 diabetes, but now he became convinced that it could do far more than that. After his 4-year experiment worked so beautifully on himself, he decided to start recommending this diet for obese children. When you read his insights into why this worked so well, it's just like reading something from Dr. Jason Fung these days. Dr. Lutz writes, "I would explain to parents as simply as I could that the carbohydrate we eat, sugar or starch, is converted to sugar in the body and enters the bloodstream. We do need a certain amount of sugar in our bloodstream, but that too much is dangerous for health. And consequently, if a lot of sugar enters the bloodstream, the hormone insulin will take immediate action to remove most of it. One of its ways, and the important one for the obese, being to convert the sugar to fat. Hence, eating a lot of carbohydrate can mean a lot of insulin being produced by the body, which can soon mean a lot of stored fat. In other words, not only did they eat too much starch and sugary food in the first place, but also, in response to all those carbohydrates, their bodies secreted an excessive amount of insulin, more than what is needed to deal with the resultant sugar." He goes on to say, "Here it seemed to me was a straightforward case of cause and effect. Too much carbohydrate equals too much insulin equals too much body fat." Lutz achieved tremendous results with overweight children whose parents made sure they complied with the recommended diet. He writes, "Without any calorie restriction whatsoever, as long as they stuck to the diet, as regularly as clockwork, every single obese child that I treated regained his or her slender figure. This 10 out of 10 result was very gratifying." Now, most of this book does not focus on diabetes. Lutz is eager to convince readers that not only diabetes, but many, many diseases and physical afflictions are a result of too many carbs in the diet, and they will typically reverse and often disappear once those carbohydrates are cut and kept low throughout one's life. He became convinced that heart disease, hardening of the arteries, and various other heart cardiovascular problems were not, as was being popularly promoted, a result of too much meat or too much animal fat, but rather they were caused by too much sugar and too many starches. After a while, Lutz decided that 30 to 40 grams of carbs per day was neither necessary nor desirable, and he began eating and recommending around 70 grams of carbs each day. Now, that's going to seem high to keto dieters these days, but remember, in those days of the 50s and 60s, a limit of 70 grams of carbs per day was probably about a fourth of what most people ingested. Dr. Lutz was essentially a family physician and not a researcher, so he couldn't do many trials and studies on his own. Most of what he learned and preached was as a result of him doing the low-carb diet on himself and recommending it to his own patients. But the successes he had both with himself and with his patients made him a firm believer. He did do one interesting study, however. He did a chicken study. Yeah, you heard me right, a chicken study. Noticing that wild chickens were mostly carnivorous, eating worms, grubs, and so forth, and that domesticated chickens were fed exclusively with grains, he decided to divide a large group of chickens into two groups. Half would be fed on grains and the other half on about 70% animal fat. Sure enough, at the end of the trial, the low-carb, high-fat chickens were healthier, more fit, and had cleaner arteries than the grain-fed chickens, who showed definite signs of artery blockage and heart problems. One doctor who examined the low-carb chickens stated, "I've examined the aortas of many thousands of chickens, and in all these years I've been doing my job, I've never seen the blood vessels with less arteriosclerosis in them. In fact, I've never seen chickens with such healthy arteries as those of your own low-carb hens." Dr. Lutz quickly saw that it was not only desirable to cut down on carbs, it was also important to eat fat and not just protein. He writes, "The only hope of keeping up a low-carbohydrate nutrition program and achieving the desired success is to replace the missing carbohydrates with fat. Humans cannot live on protein alone." He also writes, "When living on a low-carbohydrate diet, systematically cutting down on fat in the long term is by no means advisable. In fact, it must be guarded against. Fat not only provides the main source of energy, but it's also needed to provide us with certain vitamins, as well as to cater for various structural needs of the body. It is therefore essential that patients include enough fat in their food." So how did Dr. Lutz do as he progressed through his life on this low-carb menu? Well, he did very, very well. He retired at 78, but couldn't stay retired and went back into medical practice a couple of years later. He remarried at 82 and then opened a practice in London at 84. He was active and busy in helping patients nearly all his life, and he finally died at the ripe old age of 97. Not bad for a man who was almost a cripple in his 40s and seemed destined to be forced out of medical practice while still young. Dr. Lutz was low-carb when low-carb definitely was not cool. True, he wasn't as low-carb as many are today, but for his day, he was a maverick, a radical who refused to accept the high-carb status quo and dared to preach the very opposite message. He wasn't all that popular, but he's been vindicated today. Today, the message has been amplified, and study after study has demonstrated the very things Lutz was saying in the 1950s and 60s. I think the modern keto and low-carb diets are an improvement over his, so I'm not suggesting you get his books and eat precisely as he says. He was a little more liberal with his carbs and even sugar than most of us who are former diabetics or are diabetics need to be. But he led the way. Before Jason Fung, before Timothy Noakes, before Eric Westman, before Robert Atkins, there was Dr. Wolfgang Lutz from Austria, one of the few doctors that dared question the prevailing low-fat, meat causes heart attacks theories, which have been so thoroughly disproved today. Well done, Dr. Lutz. If you've just been diagnosed as diabetic, I put together a video series on overcoming runaway blood sugar that I believe can be a real help to you. You can get it in DVD format in the U.S., or you can have the videos loaded on a flash drive and sent to you. You can also download it as MP4 files, and that's for probably people from most nations. See links in the description notes below. God bless, and see you again soon.